Fam, listen up. Welcome to a new series called SMWX Nuggets. I meet many of you when I'm walking around and people say, I love the podcast, but so much is happening, I find it hard to catch up. So what we're going to do for you, let me know if you want us to carry on with this experimenting right now, is take some of the key moments from our interviews over the past week and reappraise them, bring them to you, and also give you some of my analysis of them and contextualize them too, so you can be caught up with what we've done that week. So, in today's episode, I want to take a look at two really important recent interviews. The first one is with Standard Bank Group CEO Tshabalala, and the second is with former Statistician-General Pali Lehohla. Now, what's interesting about these two interviews is while SMWX often focuses on the political situation, these are two decision makers who have a really important perspective on the economy. And increasingly, we want to start talking more about the economy and not just politics, because, of course, that's a key venue for decisions in our country as well. So firstly, I want to talk about the Tshabalala episode, because this one, wow, the audience really loved this. And it was amazing to see how viral this episode has gone. I think it's been watched over 100,000 times already. On Twitter, it's been the posts have been viewed like over 600,000 times. And Standard Bank Group CEO Tshabalala is someone who's admired and revered as one of the foremost corporate leaders in South Africa, but someone who also, because of his central role in the economy, has fascinating perspectives both on the South African economy and on geopolitics as well. So we asked him about that, and I want you to take a look at what he said, and we'll also give it a think together as we review it. Now, the first clip I think is a nugget from that. Was when Tshabalala spoke about the potential of the South African economy, because we are so drowned in bad news that we often forget how much potential this economy has and how it could be one of the world's great economies if we could get things right from a governance perspective. So take a look at what Tshabalala had to say on the SA economy here.
Would they be supported in that direction? Yes. If they were to deviate from that, would it make it more difficult to create prosperity? The answer would be yes.
Sure. I mean, one of the things, because we're such a loud and cacophonous country.
No. We are an Athenian democracy, as in Athens, where we've got a great constitution, we've got a competitive political environment, and competition in this sense, in this context, is important because it creates better outcomes. The more competition, the better the outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. And within that Athenian context, we're often focusing so much on the latest issue or the latest hope, but we often don't speak as much about just how much potential this economy has to be one of the great economies of the next century. Yeah. What are your thoughts on the potential of the South African economy to truly live up to what it can be?
Sure. I think the potential is vast. And hence, I think the sadness often, or the frustration with the missed opportunities. The potential is vast. Yeah. Again, let me talk to this trip to Zambia. Our colleagues in our network often say to us, South Africans do not realize the bequest that they have, the infrastructure. So the electricity grid, the electricity infrastructure, the logistics infrastructure, the institutions, the Department of Science and Technology is world-class. The National Treasury is ranked second or third consistently over the last couple of decades for budget transparency. It is really something to celebrate. It is really, really world-class. The central bank, the governor is ranked, is rated A. When many central banks in developed countries are rated A- and B. He's amongst the top central bank governors in the world. Our universities, University of UJ, WITS, UCT, are amongst the best academic institutions, research institutions in the world. Johannesburg and Cape Town are ranked amongst the best fintech hubs. They compare well with Berlin, Mumbai, Tel Aviv, New York. in terms of the capacity that is there, the relationship between the financial sector, the professions, the universities, and then generating great ideas and innovation in fintech. And these are things that ought to be nurtured, built upon, and accelerated. I said earlier on that we should rank higher on the global scene in terms of our competitiveness. We're currently, in the 50s. We should be in the top 20 or top 10. There's no reason why we shouldn't be. There are good things to speak to that I was referring to. We've got the resources, we've got the universities, we've got the business sector, we've got great government departments. There are some that are not great, but we've got some really, really good ones that need to be harnessed to be more productive so that we can be more competitive. But there are many things that drag us down. Our industrial policy could be better. We have deindustrialized as a country, which is why we've got a rust belt, for example, around the Vaal Triangle and around the Western Cape. We have got poverty and inequality that is not acceptable. We've got unemployment and an unemployment rate that is not acceptable. And these elements drag down our competitiveness. But we know what needs to be done. People like you speak about this and write about it. People know what they need to do to get us out there. So let me just summarize the point by saying this. South Africa needs to grow at above 3% to address the issues around poverty, inequality, and unemployment. And before the trade wars, I would have been saying to you, we think that this year South Africa could grow at 3% as it executes its structural reforms. I think it's going to be a challenge. My point to you is that it's actually possible for us to grow at above 3%. And off a base of over $400 billion, which is what our GDP is, growing at 3 to 4% is a game changer. And it answers that question that you were making, that from a banking, from a finance perspective, from a business perspective, it is possible for us to take our rightful place in the family of nations.
So there were a number of things that I think are worth pulling out of here. The first thing is just focusing on the assets that we as South Africa have. When you think of a turnaround strategy for an economy, the first thing you need to do is think, well, what things do we have that we can build on? And there is actually so much that South Africa has that we can build on. The human capital potential of our nation, the creativity, capacity, intellect of our people. If we could find a way of marshalling that properly, and that's why moving beyond social divisions is so important, because ultimately, if we could find a way, of course, to repair the social harms that have been done in our country so that we could come together and think collectively of how we take this country forward, that would obviously be a massive, massive stride for our economy. Universities, I work at a university, I work at WITS, look at the University of Cape Town, UJ, etc. Having attended one of the world's best universities, Oxford, you realize there isn't a vast gap between the people who are at our universities and those so-called global elite universities. Yes, maybe there's a bit more prestige, there's a bit more history in those universities, but South African minds are right at the cutting edge of global minds. And we're producing great people. If we could somehow expand that, I think we need a lot more universities in this country, a lot more training institutions, but not necessarily just like these old government training institutions, but things that are on the cutting edge of the new digital and global economy. How do we build on that? So I thought that was an interesting insight. It went back to something in the interview where Tshabalala was talking about productivity and how we get more out of people. That means educating them better, but also providing healthcare for them, providing security for them so that you're not worrying about these things and you can then focus on self-actualization. And that's at the heart of economic growth. He also spoke about some drawbacks which are worth thinking about. Even though he works in financial services, he spoke about the importance of industrialization and industry. And this is a serious defect of the South African economy because the key growth centers, and this goes back to even the early 2000s, have been around services and the financialization of the economy. And we haven't been able to carve out our niche as an industrial power. And so the question, I suppose, would be, if we were to do that, where are the key competitive advantages that we can focus on so that our industry can grow to the point where we are globally competitive in at least a few areas? And of course, that's something we need to think deeply about as a country. And then, poverty, inequality, unemployment, these are all massive drags on our economy. And we often think about them as humanitarian problems, which they are, but also just the way that they prevent the economy from being unlocked is a useful insight and perspective. So I thought that was a key insight. The need to grow above 3%, obviously some modeling has been done, and if we get above that 3% level, then a lot of things start to become unlocked. And of course, we're very far from that now. So I want you to have a look at another nugget from this conversation before I move on to Pali Lehohla. And this is where I was asking some Tshabalala about global politics. Of course, we're in a tumultuous global environment right now where the political and economic winds are blowing in multiple directions. And of course, that affects South Africa. So take a look at some Tshabalala's review of this situation. Are you concerned that this global environment is going to have spillover effects onto South Africa? And how do we mitigate as an economy against this uncertainty that seems to be growing both in the East and the West?
Dr. Zingiswa, sadly, it already has. Many data points. I said to you at the start of our conversation that earlier this year, our economists were projecting growth of 1.7%. We revised it down to 1.3%, largely because of the real uncertainty that the world is facing at the moment. That's the first thing. The second one is we had hoped that inflation globally would be on the decline, and therefore interest rates would be cut, and therefore create greater, a disposable income for our clients. Sadly, that looks like inflation will remain higher for longer, therefore interest rates higher for longer, therefore pressure on consumers, sadly. Am I concerned? Yes, I am. Why? Well, we know what happens when tariff walls go up. There have been many examples in history. The period of deglobalization that we are seeing now, we saw it the period between 1912 and 1945. The features are very, very similar. And it lasted, as I say, from 1912 to 1945. Have we seen a scenario where tariffs have gone up dramatically, and what was the impact? Well, we saw it with the Smoot-Hawley tariffs in 1929, imposed by the United States. And it took a long time before they were reversed, but we also know that it gave rise to potentially the depression. However, I must just make this point that it is important to understand the logic that drives nations to push up tariffs. And it is arguable that high tariffs or tariffs together with the right industrial policies actually work. That's why countries often have tariffs.
Sure.
That's why South Africa has had tariffs. It's arguable, however, that the way they get imposed often gives rise to outcomes that are inconsistent with the principles that people were trying to drive at. Tariffs often come up, and people often argue for them when the manufacturing sector becomes less competitive and when you end up with rust belts. And again, I spoke about our own rust belts here in South Africa. It was fascinating, if I could just mention this, reading an article written by the president of COSATU. It was in the Star. It's on IOL. You can Google it. Where she analyzes I think she was writing in the context of your point around geopolitics, and what is happening and how South Africa ought to be positioning itself. And she made a point which was really striking, which is the logic, the intellectual logic around the tariffs, the logic being advanced in the United States is not dissimilar to logic being advanced by the labor movement.
So, I mean, what emerges from that is firstly this fact that Standard Bank has revised economic growth from 1.7, which I think would have been quite encouraging, to 1.3. And even there, in recent days since this conversation, things are just getting even more uncertain in the global economy. So where we need to be at a minimum of 3%, we're at probably less than half of that right now. And that should give us cause for concern, because it means that all that economic potential that we spoke about is somehow being constrained either by governance, decision-making flaws, bad policies, or some combination. I thought it was interesting as well that he reflected on a piece written by Zingiswa Losi, COSATU General Secretary. And even though they may seem to come from two different places in the economy, labor and finance, this notion that a lot of what is behind this global move towards protectionism is about the way that working people have really not got a fair share of the economy. And we can criticize the policy response or the populist responses to that. However, in truth, there is a deeper insight that needs to be appreciated, which is that economic sustainability relies on working people feeling like they have a stake and feeling like they're moving forward in an economy. And clearly, we don't have that yet in South Africa, and that's something we need to think deeply about. So we also asked him about should South Africa align itself, in one way or another, and he had a very interesting take on that. So look at this piece on strategic non-alignment. In real terms, at least relatively, away from the United States as a key pole of global power. Do you think that global power has shifted, and is South Africa ready for that shift, such that we aren't dependent on either one or the other pole of that shift economically? Because some of the great economies right now have been able to, I think of India, for example, they've been able to balance their alliances across different parts of the world. And one would think in this era that's something South Africa may well need to think quite hard about.
I do think that the world is definitely headed towards a multipolar world. And again, if you read literature coming out of the US, that is how the US thinks about it. And that is how other parts of the world think about it. That is how the Singaporeans, for example, think about it. And you correctly point out that that's how the Indians think about it. I do think that as a small, open economy, it's in the best interest of South Africa to remain friends with as many people as possible. And position its trade, its investments, its goods, its people, its capital to be in the service of as many people and as many partners as is possible. So strategic non-alignment, I think, is the language that often gets used, is fundamental in that context. You've got to be able to have good relationships with as many people as possible, sticking within the four corners of laws and regulations and global norms.
So it's an interesting phrase, speaking about economies like India that have both aligned themselves with the US in some ways, or at least not estranged themselves from the US, nor countries like China as well. And Singapore is another example, even though a much smaller place. Strategic non-alignment means being able to have positive relations with all of the world. And that's economically speaking. But also geopolitically for South Africa in this moment, we need wise geopolitical minds to be able to keep relations with all the multiple powers and the multipolar system that's building in the best interests of the South African economy. So those are some nuggets from the Tshabalala interview. Please check it out. You can watch it over here. It should be somewhere on the screen. And there's a lot more where that came from. So a really important conversation on the South African economy and where it's going. Now, we also spoke to the former Statistician-General, Pali Lehohla. And the reason he's important is for 17 years, he headed up Stats SA. So when we hear about unemployment statistics or we hear about the population size, we realize that that is a crucial institution which gives us the data we need to then decide where the South African economy is going. Things like economic growth itself are determined in Stats SA. And he was the person who headed up that institution. Now, he knows a lot, clearly, about South Africa from a data perspective. He's stepped away from being Statistician-General and now is speaking quite a lot more freely on his views on the South African economy. Now, the first thing that I thought was a nugget from this interview was where he said he thinks the NDP was a flop, the National Development Plan. Take a look at what he had to say here. Feels like as time went on, you became even more and more outspoken. But recently, you were quite outspoken about the National Development Plan, which you've called a flop. Take us through why you think that the aspirations we've put down on paper are just not enough to take us to where we need to go as a nation.
Yes, I mean, if by a plan, I say if wishes were horses, beggars could ride. That's what that document represents. It's a good document because Parliament said we like it. All sides of Parliament said we like this. But there was no path to achieving that. There was no moment to think, what does it take to do the things that we aspire for?
Yeah.
And we are trapped in that. And we are trapped in actually quoting it all the time. Speech after speech. I mean, it's meaningless. Completely meaningless.
Yeah.
We haven't, you see, if we cannot have future proof of anything, then you have a serious problem. Future proof is not foolproof. But future proof makes you to attend to the things that have to be done to achieve that which you have specified as or something that we want to do. Take, for instance, the president's speech says we'll put 900 billion in infrastructure over the next, I think it says 5 years or 3 years, it doesn't matter.
Right.
Let me say it's 5 years or 3 years. It really matters not, because 900 billion for effective infrastructure,
It's just not enough.
which then deals with gross fixed capital formation, is just not enough.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Now, when you leave that to fortune,
Yeah.
the amount is so small that you'd rather use it for something else rather than an illusion, being delusional about fixed capital formation that can actually impact on growth and impact on dealing with the backlogs.
And it sounds like a big number, so everyone thinks...
Well, that's what mesmerizes our parliamentarians that cannot relate to this number in as far as fixed capital formation is concerned. So when you don't have, you are not savvy technically around what the meaning of these things are, you have a serious problem.
How much investment in infrastructure do you think we need over a 3-year period to really get this economy into gear?
Well, now you talk about gear. Well, there's an experiment that we had, which was very interesting. It probably was not labeled anything. It was just a set of policies that were put together.
Yeah.
But the experiment is worth going back to. And I had some arguments with colleagues more recently, and I continue to have those. If you look at 2002, up to 2007.
That
by
period
2007, there were things that in an economy that is developmental, you are more likely to get those outcomes. One, poverty was reduced.
Yeah, sure.
Both multidimensionally and otherwise. Not to the level that you need to reduce it, but you could see a place like Msinga, and I want to talk about Msinga shortly, which was the poorest as of 2001, moving fast to reducing all its poverty by up to 60%.
Wow. Yeah, sure. So something was happening in that era.
Something was happening, but Msinga is an important one. I'll come back to that. Gross fixed capital formation.
Sure.
Which is what the question we're asking: how much do you need to invest?
Yeah, basically around infrastructure and building things.
It was 25% of the GDP annually.
Right. So about a quarter of annual GDP.
In fact, at 30%, you are flying.
Sure.
25% is fine.
Right.
So 25% of the GDP was piled back into the economy every year in infrastructure.
So there he speaks on something that I think many people share, which is lots of plans, lots of hopes and aspirations, lots of speeches. I saw the president giving another speech this week. But really, something happens between these plans and the actual implementation. And when you really think of the NDP, I must say this was something that I think was published in 2010. And it had all these amazing goals by 2030 for where the country needed to get to. And then suddenly here we sit in 2025, 5 years away. And it's fairly obvious that we're going to fall far, painfully short of most of those aspirations. On unemployment, I think it was like we were going to cut it in half. We were going to grow at 6%. We were going to spend on public infrastructure. And clearly, like he says about public infrastructure, part of the reason why we have potholes, why water isn't being reticulated properly, why we've had these major energy problems is misgovernance, but it's also underinvestment. And so when you don't spend on public infrastructure, you can't turn around and be surprised that public infrastructure is crumbling. And when you add bad governance of that crumbling infrastructure on top of that, that's why many of our towns, cities, rural areas, townships, informal settlements are in the state that they're in now. So the other interesting thing that he spoke about was about capturing South Africa's mineral wealth. I want you to take a look at what he had to say over here.
We don't have a middle class. That's one. And we have a captured top 3 or 2%. And they have nothing to show by themselves. You created nothing. And when you have created nothing and you are around the table, you can't create something. And we need to introspect very, very, very seriously.
Yeah.
That the only condition that we can do something is to create our own table. And the ingredients for that table are there. You have the majority population. You have things that you can change in the laws on ownership. For the benefit, you cannot deal with this crisis of education, of only 10% of the population having the technical know-how to lead, where the world succeeds when it has 50% or more of their population having that ability. It cannot be business as usual. The minerals have to be able to do that. It's not tax. Tax is too little. Anyway, even when it is there, we steal it. So the absence of discipline. So it is using these assets as sovereign wealth to create the necessary human resources that are required. At this rate, we are not going anywhere. Dangote, patriotic capital, invests in Nigeria, gross fixed capital formation, the biggest refinery in the world. Traore says, the uranium, I'm taking it. And with Niger and Mali, they do that. South Africa has so much.
So number one, he says the middle class is captured, that there really isn't a middle class, and those people in the middle class or above basically don't really produce anything of value, particularly Black South Africans. So serious indictment there on those Black South Africans who have been able to rise through the economy and how we haven't been able to create a truly shared base of wealth. But also just solving for how we get more out of our mineral wealth. I think this is such an important economic conversation. Let's park the ideological conversation, right, on nationalization versus privatization. What if we come together as a country and we say, we are solving for this particular problem? How do we get more benefit from our mineral wealth? And we need proposals on the table. We need modeling done because I think we can all agree we're not getting enough benefit from our mineral wealth right now. So the question is, given where we are, we don't want to go backwards, but how can we get more? because clearly the mineral wealth is massive, right? So let's get proposals on the table to solve for that problem. It may be some combination of sovereign wealth fund or a national wealth fund. I've spoken about that in some writing. If it's about taxation, then what are the policies? What are the taxation policies that would get us more? What is the amount we want to get to, and how do we get to that amount? Because we've got the easy part is we've got the wealth. Many countries don't have the wealth. All we need to understand is how do we govern that wealth so that we get more into our coffers, so that that amount that goes into the coffers is able to be spent on developmental questions like health, like education, like public infrastructure, like public safety, which goes back to some Tshabalala's points about how we make this economy more productive. So I think we need to have a real serious public debate about how do we get more from our mineral wealth. Bring your proposals, let's look at international best practice, and let's create a regulatory regime, the next phase of a regulatory regime, which brings us more from our mineral wealth. Cool. So that's the first installment of SMWX Nuggets. Let me know if you enjoyed this experiment, if you enjoyed this episode, if you got something out of it, and we'll keep doing these for you. Thanks so much for liking, sharing, subscribing. Our next goal is 250,000 subscribers, so make sure you click that subscribe button and keep it locked on SMWX. As always, aye.